Sandy, can we all be muted so that there's not any background, please?
Oh, sure, sure. In fact, yeah, if you all could mute yourselves, I'm going to trust you to do that. Now, I have recording on, and I'm going to get us started on Facebook, and then we can. Sorry, I am not very good at this, I have to admit.
It's recording. It shows that it's recording.
Oh, it's recording on Zoom. It's getting it started on Facebook Live. Oh, shoot.
Andy, it says recording, so you should be able to start.
Well, no, it is recording on Zoom. It's not recording.
I see recording on ours too.
What's that?
I see recording on the Zoom.
It is, but it's what I'm trying to do is go live. You know, I think it's about to. I'm just watching right now. Oh, come on. You know, why don't you go ahead and start? I'm going to get this, I'll get this working somehow. So I apologize.
Well, good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. My name is John Michael Cotignola Pickens, and I am with CeaseFire Pennsylvania. I serve as their campaign organizer for Central Pennsylvania. I just started last month, so I am still very new to the organization, but not new to the work of gun violence prevention. And CeaseFire has never had a staff person based out of Central Pennsylvania, so this is an experiment for them, and I am thrilled to be here with all of you and happy that Sandy and Kelsey were willing to host me for this. I am going to share my screen. And Sandy, it says that the host disabled me from being able to share my screen.
Yes, apologize. I apologize.
In the meantime, I'll introduce myself. I'm Kelsey Reyes. I'm a staff member with the PA Council of Churches. I am actually doing a year-long service program with the Sycamore House in Harrisburg, and my partnering organization is the PA Council of Churches. I'm really excited to work with John Michael on this project and share it all with you guys.
Great. Okay, so you should be good now.
Can everyone see that? Wonderful. So this is going to just be provide some background on gun violence in Pennsylvania. Depending on your knowledge, this might all be very familiar to you, but I hope some or most of you do take something away from this. So Kelsey and I already introduced ourselves, and again, I'm grateful to Kelsey and Sandy for hosting me for this. So just, I guess, a little bit more about CeaseFire. We are Pennsylvania's largest and longest serving statewide gun violence prevention organization. We started in 2001. We were completely volunteer run for the first 6 years. It was started by a couple of women after they participated in the Million Mom March in 2001 and decided that they needed to do something about gun violence in Pennsylvania. And so then they started a CeaseFire chapter. As I was telling Rachel earlier, CeaseFire, I believe, started in Chicago, but now several states have their own separate CeaseFire chapters. We don't have really a relationship with each other, so we are our own independent nonprofits. As it says here, we work to end the epidemic of gun violence through education, so seminars like this, coalition building, so really doing some networking and relationship building with people all across the board, whether that's faith leaders, community groups, gun violence survivors. And then we also do a lot of advocacy, which we will be talking about some policies that CeaseFire is really working on and really trying to get people to support and rally around. And just that last point, we have a network of 60,000 citizens, students, faith leaders, community groups, and hopefully that number continues to increase. And I will say that we really try to uplift the voices of gun violence survivors. They are the ones who should be leading the charge, and we should be following them. And I come from this work with a personal story of being a gun violence survivor. I lost my grandfather to gun violence. He took his own life after suffering with Alzheimer's when I was 3 years old. So I very much approach this work from a personal passion. So now I will hand things off to Kelsey.
Okay, awesome. So my role in tonight is kind of just discussing and posing questions about how, as Christians and part of Christian organizations, how can we approach the issue of gun violence and gun reform in Pennsylvania. So I have 3 questions up. We're not going to discuss them all right now. I do want to pose and discuss the first one. So what is your knowledge of PA gun laws and gun violence? And so if anybody just wants to use a little emoji, hand raise emoji, and you can just kind of talk about your background.
You can unmute yourself and say something if you'd like.
Yeah, that works.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say I'm very unfamiliar with Pennsylvania gun laws and gun violence, and that's part of the reason why I'm on this session this afternoon. Thank you for making it available.
Okay, and so then I have 2 other questions, and these are just 2 questions that, oh, did you raise your hand? I'm sorry. Oh, you're muted. I can't hear what you're saying.
No, I'm sorry. I was just scratching my head.
Oh, okay. My bad. Okay, so yeah, so these last 2 questions are just kind of things I want to be keeping in the back of our head as John Michael goes along with the presentation. And then there'll be a slide at the end where I will be discussing some more other things and then bring these questions back up. So the first one out of the 2 is, what do you believe should be the Christian response to gun violence and gun reform in PA? And what ways as the Christian community can we support gun violence prevention? So just to keep these in the back of our mind as we go through this presentation.
Thank you, Kelsey. And just some brief goals about these presentations. I hope that you do come away from this with an understanding of how gun violence does impact us as Pennsylvanians, learn about why gun violence continues, and then we'll briefly talk about how you can be a good communicator when it comes to talking about gun violence. And so we'll, touch on that. So before we really get into things, some brief information on Pennsylvania voters. So back in 2019, which of course feels a long ways away, F&M, Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster poll showed that 64% of Pennsylvania registered voters supported laws that regulate that gun ownership, or have stronger regulations on gun ownership is what I should have put. And that has actually an increase from 2018, so it continues to increase. And then Giffords is a gun violence prevention education organization and advocacy that was started by Gabby Giffords, who is a former congresswoman. She herself was shot, and I forget what year, and so it really left her disabled, and out of that she started Giffords and has become such a strong voice for gun violence prevention. And so every year, I believe, they give states a letter grade on how each state's laws are. And so Pennsylvania got a C+. And the main reason for those is that we do not, and I'll be talking about at least the background checks and ERPOS. And so Pennsylvania does not require a background check on all shotgun and rifle sales. That's particularly in private sales, which I'll talk about. And then Pennsylvania does not have an extreme risk protection order bill. One has been introduced, but that has not been passed. And again, I will talk about that in more detail. And as a state, we do not prohibit the sale of military-style rifles or large capacity magazines. And the source for this was from WHYY, which is an NPR station out of Philadelphia. And if any of you do want to check on that, it's a great little story. And so let's get into some numbers. So the most recent statistics we have for us, the state, are 2018. And as you see here, it is close to 1,600 deaths from gun violence in 2018. And it's broken down. 62% was suicide, 35% was homicide, and 48% was other. And that's mostly what we call unintentional shootings, which is shootings by a child that may find a gun that hasn't been locked up and doesn't know that the gun is loaded, and so they unintentionally shoot their sibling or their friend or even an adult, and they unfortunately kill them. And so that's what the other is. So yeah, as you can see, gun violence really does impact us. And suicide, that is a nationwide trend as well. Most of gun violence deaths are suicides, so that does fit in with the national trend. So greater than 50% of people killed in domestic violence disputes during 2018 were shot. And in the past decade, and I should say the majority of them were women. And in the past decade, firearms have accounted for the most domestic violence deaths every year. So if a firearm is a part of a domestic dispute, it will most of the time lead to at least one of the partners dead. And again, just a very sobering statistic. Abused women are 5 times more likely to be killed by their abuser if the abuser has a firearm. And then this relates to extreme risk protection orders, which again, I will be talking about in more detail here soon, but just a real quick story of how personal gun violence is Jennifer Lugar's husband, Scott, had struggled with depression and suicidal ideation. Despite all of this, it says he had been a responsible gun owner, but in 2009, he took his own life with his own gun. And then since then, Jennifer has been a strong advocate for extreme risk protection orders, which are very effective with suicides. Like I said, suicides are the top cause of firearm deaths. It takes the lives of 2 Pennsylvanians a day. And firearms are responsible for 50% of suicide deaths. And here's the thing, 90% of suicide attempt survivors won't try again if they survive the first attempt. And so if you have a firearm, I mean, you're more than likely going to be able to end your own life. And so making it more difficult for people who are depressed or have suicidal ideation, it really will decrease the suicide rate. And then homicides. So as you see here, 76% of all homicides involve a gun. Firearm homicide is 8 times more likely to happen to Black people, and actually people of color are mostly impacted by firearm homicide. And we can certainly talk about why we think that is.
Michael, can I just comment back on suicide? My understanding is that the great majority of the suicides are by men. Women often, obviously, also commit suicide, but many times it's by other means, such as medicine or something like that. But many times, the problem with firearm suicides, my understanding is that they're almost always lethal, whereas other means are not always, successful.
Correct. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Curtis. Yes, the majority of suicides are men, and I think what's really interesting is, the suicide rate among veterans keeps going up, and then even here in central Pennsylvania, I saw a couple of recent articles talking about the suicide rate among dairy farmers. And so that's something I didn't even think about. But the suicide rate among dairy farmers, especially during the recession, 2008, but this was an article in 2018 that was talking about how these are dairy farmers that the price of milk is dropping significantly. They're having to sell their farms, having to sell their cattle. And so they have access to, they more than likely have access to firearms. And so that's just a side of suicide and a population that we don't really talk about much are farmers. And so thank you, Curtis. Yes, that's interesting. And then the last major thing are mass shootings. And I should say that per capita, so in my first presentation, someone asked me, well, what is that like in relation to? And so that is 100,000 people. We figured it out. So it's number of shootings, so it's 1.13 per 100,000 people. So Pennsylvania ranks 14th in the nation when it comes to mass shootings. We've had 101 mass shootings between 2013 to 2019. And as you see here, we have 63% more mass shootings in states with strong gun safety laws. So we have quite a bit of work to do when it comes to gun violence prevention. And I know we're all not from Dauphin County, but this is just an example of how gun violence impacts a local community. And so I found all these statistics from the Pennsylvania Department of Health Violence Dashboard, which you can find. So if you live in Lancaster County, if you live in Berks County, wherever you live, you can find the impact of gun violence in your own county. And so the trend is, you see that from 2016 to 2017, there was a jump in homicides, and then it was cut in 2018. Unfortunately, they don't have the numbers for 2019 down in the dashboard yet. And I do know that 2020 has been really, really difficult year when it has come to homicides and I'm sure suicides. I know that Harrisburg, we have had 15 homicides this year. So as you can see, that's more than 2018. And then I know Philadelphia, which is where CeaseFire is based, they've had over 350 gun violence homicides. So it truly is a pandemic in Philadelphia. And I would say for Harrisburg, we're a city of about 40,000 people. And so to have 15 homicides, that's pretty dramatic as well. So some crowd participation. So please feel free to unmute yourselves and just chime in with your answers. These are simple true or false. So in Pennsylvania, someone can purchase 100 guns at one time if they choose to do so. Is that true or false?
True.
True.
Correct. Yes, true. In Pennsylvania, gun owners are legally required to report the loss or theft of their firearms.
No.
False.
False.
And I saw that John Hayden was on here. John, I think it's cheating if you answer these. John was on an earlier one of these last week. In Pennsylvania, you can own a gun before you can rent a car.
True.
True.
Yes, that is true. In Pennsylvania, it's illegal to purchase a gun for someone else.
False.
Oh. Oh, that's true.
True or false, municipalities can establish their own gun violence prevention laws.
False.
False.
That is false. And CeaseFire actually is just a part of a lawsuit with the city of Philadelphia, and I believe the city of Pittsburgh as well. They are suing the Pennsylvania General Assembly here in Harrisburg. So this is called preemption, that there is a law of preemption that says that no municipality can establish their own gun violence prevention laws. And so the lawsuit is basically saying that that someone's access to guns, that right is kind of superseding someone's right to live a safe and healthy life. That's the basic gist of the lawsuit. There's more to it than that. But yes, so CeaseFire is in the courts as we speak, arguing about this and trying to overturn this. True or false? Firearms training is required when you purchase a gun.
False.
False. Recommended, but not.
So yeah, I could go and purchase a gun and would not have to go through any training whatsoever, even though I have only handled a gun once, and that was when I was shooting at a pumpkin at my cousin's. So CeaseFire has something, we are trying to build a coalition around what's called the Common Agenda. And so we have 3 policy asks that we are really trying to build around. And that's comprehensive background checks, extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOS for short, and lost or stolen reporting requirement. Number 1, Pennsylvania background check requirements. So here in Pennsylvania, licensed dealers, all sales must include a background check. The really tricky thing is when it is a private seller. So only handguns are required for background checks, not long guns. And so a long gun could be an antique, could be your grandfather's gun that you have in the attic and you don't know what to do, and so you then sell it to someone. So you don't need to do a background check on the person you're selling that antique gun to. Or it could be to a military style weapon that is being sold as well by you. And again, a background check is not necessary for that if you're a private seller. As shown here, long guns are heavily used in police, mass, and domestic violence shootings. And so having background checks, especially for private sellers, would cut down on mass shootings and even on domestic violence. As you see here, there was a survey done by Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health that found that there's 88% of Americans, and that's gun owners and non-gun owners, support universal background checks. So, and this was a nationwide survey, and so there is a lot of support for this. So, and actually I should say, on a federal level, it's even scarier that private sellers do not need a background check for handguns or long guns. So federally, things are kind of scarier than here in Pennsylvania. So that's connected to this. So what we're asking for with background checks is federally close the loophole that would allow any gun sold by private sale to be sold without background check. And then here in Pennsylvania, close the loophole that would allow any long gun sold by private sale to be sold without background check. And what is important to mention, what's excluded in here is what's called a family transfer. So if I were to transfer ownership of a gun to my wife or a parent-child, that would be exempt from a background check. Next is extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOs. And so these have been gaining a lot of press recently, and they actually have bipartisan support federally and even here in Pennsylvania. The ERPO bill here in Pennsylvania was introduced by a Republican, but it still has not passed. And so what an ERPO is a civil court order, not a criminal court. It's really important to make that distinction. So someone would not have a criminal record if they had an ERPO issued against them. And what an ERPO does is it temporarily removes firearms from someone who is deemed to be in crisis. And so if a family member or a former intimate partner sees behavior like maybe someone is abusing an animal when they usually don't, or they're threatening themselves or threatening others, or if someone breaks a PFA, those are some things that could lead to an ERPO. And again, no criminal record or involuntary commitment. And again, that's important as well, is that someone would not be 302'd or would not be institutionalized for an ERPO. They prevent mass shootings, as you see here in California. 21 of 159 ERPO cases showed clear signs that they intended to commit a mass shooting. After an ERPO was issued, none did. And then they're really effective with preventing suicide. Connecticut has the oldest ERPO, and it was created in 1999. And as you see, there was a 13.7 decline in the suicide rate in Connecticut. And as you see here in Indiana as well, a 7.5 decline. And so again, 7.5%, 13.7% may not seem like that large of a number, but that's a pretty dramatic decrease in the suicide rate and a lot of lives that have been saved by ERPOs being implemented. And so this is the process, just a very quick description of how an ERPO works. Again, if a family member, a household member, so it could be a roommate, an intimate partner, or law enforcement sees someone acting or saying things that they want to harm themselves or harm other people, there will be an emergency hearing upon the ERPO being filed, and it would be without the respondent or the attorney, so it would just be the people who are filing it and the judge. And then the final hearing would be within 10 days of that, with the respondent and attorney and testimony from witnesses. And so the determination, again, would be people would be able to testify and say, well, they threatened to harm me, or they broke a PFA, or they were harming their pets when maybe that's not normal behavior. So then they would have this criteria to base it off of. Firearms would be removed immediately. And this would last for up to a year. Now, the respondent can petition the court for the ERPO to last less than a year, but that has to be, they have to petition the court for it to not last a year. And if needed, if the person has not really shown that their status has changed after a year, then the witnesses, the family members, the household members, whoever filed the ERPO has to refile. And so another ERPO could be issued for another year, but they have to go through the process all over again. And then lost or stolen reporting. This is again the third policy that CeaseFire is really promoting.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Sure, yeah, go right ahead, Curtis.
So one question that I have about the ERPO is I would imagine that with some people, if they come to take away their firearms, they could be violent. I'm just wondering what especially in states that have implemented this kind of legislation, how that particular factor has played out, if you know.
So that's a great question, and I don't know the full answer to that. I have read stories of concerns from law enforcement about that, on how to make sure that they are protected when they go to retrieve the weapons. And so, yes, that is an ongoing conversation. I know between how to best handle that. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have really a good answer for that, other than it's just an ongoing conversation, and that there is tension and there are concerns about that. So according to Giffords, there are 380,000 guns are stolen annually, and this is nationwide. And then what often happens with those guns is that they are trafficked. Sometimes they're used for to purchase drugs, or they're often used in violent crimes. And so, like I said, with those true or false, gun owners do not have to report that their guns have been stolen or that they're lost here in Pennsylvania. But if there's a requirement, then it would allow law enforcement to track those guns, which would then hopefully stop those guns from getting into the hands of people that would then use them for violent crimes. So this has been a major issue in Chicago. Chicago, of course, is often used as an example by the other side, by the NRA and others, to talk about, well, Chicago has these strong gun violence prevention laws, but look at Chicago. But we don't talk about what's happening in Chicago is that a lot of the guns that are being used in homicides are guns that are trafficked in from states like Pennsylvania. And so having lost or stolen reporting would also then positively impact other cities like Chicago. And then lost or stolen reporting can stop straw purchasers. This is something that the local chapter of Heeding God's Call here in Harrisburg was really working on. Does anyone know what straw purchasers are? And just please feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. When I say straw purchaser, do you know who that is?
Does that mean you buy it for someone else?
Yes, a straw purchaser is someone who is legally able to buy a gun, but they buy it for someone who's legally not allowed to have a firearm. So yes, that is a straw purchaser. And I should say, Heeding God's Call, if people aren't familiar, they are a faith-based organization that started out of Philadelphia that is working on gun violence prevention as well. And so they have several chapters. And like I said, several years ago here in Harrisburg, they were really working on straw purchasers. And so if someone, what happens with straw purchasers and with guns that are used in violent crimes is, since people aren't required to report them lost or stolen, if the gun is used in a homicide, they can simply say, oh, I didn't realize my gun was stolen or lost. And so this is an excuse that's oftentimes used. Whereas if this was implemented, they would not have that excuse anymore. And so again, if enacted, it would rightfully place the onus on gun owners to keep better track of their firearms. And I just find this really disturbing. A study found nearly 33% of firearms recovered at Pittsburgh crime scenes were said to have been stolen. I see there's something in the chat.
Sorry, that was me.
Okay.
You can ignore it.
Okay. So with lost and stolen, the requirement would be that you report the firearm is missing within 3 days. And enforcement is if they're not people aren't compliant, there would be a $500 fine or a summary first-time offense, and that increases with potential jail time with each subsequent offense. Again, it creates a legal obligation for owners to track their guns, to be responsible with them, which is something that CeaseFire is just really wanting to promote. I should have said that CeaseFire is not anti-gun. We are pro-responsible gun ownership. And it's CeaseFire's belief that this would have the greatest impact on communities that are most impacted by gun violence. So here in Harrisburg, Allison Hill, that is dramatically impacted by gun violence. We think that oftentimes here in Harrisburg, guns that are used in Allison Hill and in homicides are guns that have been lost or stolen. And so if those guns were reported, then that would dramatically cut down on the homicides here in Allison Hill and in other cities, hopefully.
I'd just like to comment that as far as I'm concerned, this piece of legislation, or getting reporting lost and stolen guns, I just really hope that can pass and that we can do advocacy around that, because I just think, I mean, if when they report that it's lost or stolen, every gun has an identification number, an ID number, and so you can't trace it back to the owner, and so it really increases, as you said, John Michael, the responsibility of owners, and then there's no profit motive now for selling straw purchasers, or straw purchasing, and so I just really hope that that we can collaborate and others can collaborate to see that kind of legislation pass here in Pennsylvania.
Can I just add something here? I'll mention. We first actually worked on this, and we did a resolution back in, I want to say 2008, 2009. There was legislation that had been proposed that far back, and in Pennsylvania they say it often takes multiple sessions to get something through. So we're hoping that constant pressure over the years will help with this, but it is something that it's not like this is just coming up. It has been going on for a long time.
Is there a name or a number of that bill?
Sandy, do you happen to know the name or the number of that bill?
I will find it. I
Yeah.
do have it. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's unlikely that it's going to go anywhere before the end of this year, and we're probably going to be looking at reintroducing in the next session.
Okay, thank you.
And so I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Kelsey. So go ahead, Kelsey.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm back again to just again talk about, as Christians and people of faith organizations, what is the Christian element to gun violence and gun violence prevention. And so here, John Michael has graciously found 3 passages of scripture that don't discuss gun violence, because guns weren't the weapon of use back then, but of violence, and just Jesus's response in those situations. So in Mark 11, 1 through 11, this is when Jesus comes to Jerusalem as king. And so this is the story of him riding the colt in the parade, people lying cloaks and palms on the ground and cheering and praising him as he goes through. And so this story, when you initially read it, doesn't really, like, you don't think, oh, like this can relate to gun violence. Well, the way that we interpret it and we see it is, during this time period, this is when, like, if an army conquered another country or king or such, they would hold these military parades in the same manner, where they'd be riding down on a horse and people would be cheering the sides. And so this is the same kind of format that Jesus uses on the colt, and with people cheering and praising. But in this scenario, there's no use of violence. And so I think this is a really good story to say, there's no need to use weapons to solve conflicts. Jesus never promoted violence in terms of killing somebody. And so he was representation of peace and love and hope. And he has the same format as a military parade, but there is no violence in his parade. In the next passage, Luke 22, 47 through 52, Jesus' portrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is the story of Judas comes up to Jesus to kiss him on the cheek, and Jesus outs him as the betrayer. The other disciples hear him say this, and they all take out their swords. And in that moment of heat, a servant's ear is cut off, and Jesus says, "Stop," and he heals the servant's ear. And then the priests and the guards descend onto him, and Jesus is quoted saying, "I am leading a rebellion that you have come to. Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs?" And so again, referencing the idea that this concept that when something happens, the first resort is violence. And Jesus is saying, why, what about me has a need for violence? What about my message and my life do you need to resort to using a sword and club on me? Where peace and just discussion should be the path, and not resorting to killing automatically. In the third passage, Matthew 26:52, is Matthew's version of Jesus's betrayal. And so this little snippet is Jesus saying, "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him. "For all who draw the sword will die by the sword." And once again, just reiterating that fact that following Jesus and following the way he lived his life was without use of a weapon, without use of harm. And so just to follow that way of life and not in a conflict, to not resort to using a gun, to not using a sword, knife, whatever it may be. So that's my little spiel. John Michael?
Thank you, Kelsey. And so, just really briefly, some things to think about when you're communicating about gun violence is to start with the problem. And to not necessarily start with statistics, though, is to make it personal, to connect it to local concerns, whether that's in your own city, town. I mean, whenever I go into rural Lancaster County, I'll talk about dairy farmers and the impact of gun violence on dairy farmers. So yeah, make it personal. Frame it as an issue that everyone can relate to, and avoid the opposition perspective that we want to seize guns. Again, CeaseFire is not, we are not about seizing guns, but we are about safety and responsible gun ownership. And as Kelsey talked about, as Christians, that's what Jesus very much spoke out against the cycle of violence. And so it is a huge problem, right? There is so much to talk about, and I could have overwhelmed you with many more statistics, with a lot of stories about how gun violence has traumatized Pennsylvanians. But that can become overwhelming. And so focus on part of the problem. Or in this presentation, I focused on 3 solutions. Talk about 1 to 2 facts. Specifics, not generalities, are really helpful. If we get into generalities or hypotheticals, that just we can just talk in circles. And so now I just want to open it up to questions for you all, if you do have any. And if I can't answer your questions, I know Sandy or Kelsey can try and help me as well. But if none of us can, then we'll get back to you with an answer. So like Curtis, you asked that question earlier about ERPOS and people not wanting to hand over their firearms and responding violently. And so I will certainly look more into that and get back to you on that. So please, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your question.
Hi, this is Dave. I have a couple questions. What is the strategy, the timelines, and the layout of a plan to put legislation in place? And how is it tied in with legislators? And are there pockets of group working on this now, or are we just starting this from the scratch right now?
So no, well, here in central Pennsylvania feels somewhat like we're starting from scratch as far as CeaseFire's perspective. CeaseFire has been doing this work for a long time, is particularly in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And so the timeline is, so the common agenda, which is what we're calling this, will be introduced officially in January. But there is a sign-on letter, there is a petition that we're asking people to sign on to. I mean, we're asking people to write letters to the editor about these issues. And so, but we'll especially be focusing on this after the election because there are a lot of candidates here locally in the state that are running off of common sense gun legislation, and so we're hoping that they win their races, and then we can work with them to implement this strategy.
I would recommend that if it's not in place, that be put in order of like when you're going to do letters to the editor, when you're going to solicit legislators, what your goal is for organizing, how you're going to organize and move people, and give this a solid push across the state, and nail these legislators down. Who's the opposition? People need to know that, and who's on board with it. And I think now's the prime time to do this. But I personally need organization with it, so we're not just talking a lot of things about this and then people respond when they see things coming together in a structure. I do. I should speak for myself. I respond when there's structure and there's a plan. Just saying.
Thank you. And that plan is being worked on. And so there is structure and like I said, this will be rolled out more in January after the elections.
Thank you.
And we'll be working with CeaseFire and with Heeding God's Call as well, because we all try to stay in touch with each other. So that will be happening.
Can you share with me the relationship between CeaseFire and Heeding God's Call? What is those two separate organizations, and how are they working at this?
Yes, so we are two separate organizations, and Heeding God's Call and CeaseFire are a part of a coalition that just started. That's called Pennsylvania PA the number 4 GVP, so Pennsylvanians for Gun Violence Prevention. And so both organizations are a part of that broader coalition that will be focusing on this common agenda. And again, that's a statewide coalition. And so we're in close communication with one another.
Is this, actually, I have to ask this, is this different from Pennsylvania Safety Alliance? Or is it a different name?
I think it's different.
Oh, okay. Because we're part of that, and I know CeaseFire is as well.
Okay.
I'll jump back in with another question, or a statement maybe, but I anticipate violence going up after this election, and the importance to know where the hate groups are and people that are most likely to pull off some kind of craziness following this election, whichever way it goes. I expect there could be more violence. And I think the timing of this is essential to, I think the messaging is essential at key points along the way, so that, what am I trying to say? So that you're not stirring up the NRA, picking a fight that you don't need, but to lay out things clearly in a methodical plan, message-wise, so that people are clear with that and they know what you're standing for and against. Just some thoughts. I'll shut up now. I'm talking too much. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to be in conversation with someone in Gettysburg who is the convener of Gettysburg for Gun Sense. And so militias have been really active in Gettysburg. And so CeaseFire is in partnership with Gettysburg for Gun Sense, and that's a conversation I'm looking forward to about how we can best partner with each other to address the militias that have unfortunately been very active there. And so yes, that is a conversation that we're a part of. So thank you. I just put a link to our petition in the chat. Please feel free to sign that if you feel comfortable doing so and sharing that with other people.
I do want to reinforce, I think it is important what Dave has said, that we need to make sure to deliver that message, to make it crystal clear that, nobody is out to take away folks' guns. Although we've said that consistently from the beginning, that we don't have a problem with the legitimate ownership of guns. In other words, people have guns for hunting. People will sometimes keep guns in their home or business, to protect themselves. But we're not advocating that those be taken away. And unfortunately, it still gets twisted into the slippery slope argument. And I think we just have to keep saying, no, that's not the case. We're not there to take away your guns, and reinforce the message that this is, I don't know if we want to, say common sense, whatever the terminology is, but that, the real goal is just to protect people from gun violence, to reduce the level of gun violence.
HA, you're muted.
HA, you're muted. We didn't hear any of that.
I apologize. I thank you all for participating in this. Unfortunately, I have to run to another Zoom conference right now. So we'll stay in touch along the way and include me in next steps, okay? Thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions, I will just say that if you are on Facebook, CeaseFire is on Facebook. Please follow us. Please, you can sign up for our emails on our website, which is CeaseFirePA.org. And so Dave or David, you mentioned having a plan and structure. And so again, that is one way we will be communicating with people about what that plan is. Since we have never had a staff person in Central Pennsylvania, early on, what my role is developing relationships with people and just making sure that they know CeaseFire does have a presence here. And so, and really lifting up the work that is already being done here in Central Pennsylvania around gun violence prevention. And so that's one reason I'm grateful for the Council of Churches. And so, yes, our plan will be coming out and it will have structure to it. And so if you want to stay in touch with us, please sign up, or you can directly email me. I guess I can put my email in the chat. And
I'll tell you what, I can also share that. I'm going to share a couple of things as follow-up to this call, so I can do that as well.
Just share my email?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
I will also share. In fact, John Michael, if you could share with me about the other coalition that you were talking about, and I can share about the Pennsylvania Safety Alliance as well, because there's a number of folks involved with that. We are working, we are trying to work very hard together statewide to make all of this happen.
Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time and your questions and your engagement. And we will be calling on you as advocates, I hope, to speak out against gun violence here in Pennsylvania and to hopefully build towards a Pennsylvania that's safe for everyone. So thank you, Sandy and Kelsey. And hope the rest
Thank
of you
you.
have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.